Hello, everybody. My name is Reese, and today we're going to answer the question, what are paradigms? It's going to be great. So as a reminder, this is part of Roote, which is a online school and fellowship to learn about systems thinking. If you're not already in the fellowship, please check out Roote.co and join a community of world-class systems thinkers looking to understand and build the future. It's good stuff. Join a great crew. So at a high-level overview, remember that right now we're talking about thinking in systems generally, and then later we're going to get to points 2 through 5 there. And within thinking in systems, last time we chatted about how to think in systems, and this time we're going to chat about paradigms. So, paradigms. We're going to chat about all these delightful things. We're going to define paradigms. We're going to understand why they come during a crisis. We're going to look at them through this 5 whys perspective. We're going to really get into defining a paradigm as like part of these 3 pillars. And then we're going to look at how paradigms are actually embodied in things, in language and metaphor, and also in institutions. So that is today. So paradigms, the word paradigm was first introduced in 1962 in this book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You can tell the book cover's funny. And this book was all about how people do science, and that there's normal science where people are understanding, pre-theory of relativity, here's how physics works. And then after theory of relativity, it's like, oh, there's this new paradigm, things are crazy. And so that's what the book was about, was defining these paradigm shifts in science specifically. But it doesn't do that good of a job of defining them. It kind of gets at these underlying ideas, but doesn't do that good of a job of defining them. When people also think about paradigms, they think about, in kind of the non-scientific sense, they think about them as just these default assumptions. There's this great parable where one fish asks the other fish, how's the water? And then the other fish says, what the hell is water? And the idea here is that these fish don't know really what water is. Water's all around them all the time. And so too in society are these default assumptions all around us all the time. That's what we mean by paradigms. They're these set of unconscious default assumptions. Okay? And they're really based off of this idea that there's the reality underneath. There's this actual reality, trees and nature and whatever. And then there's the symbols that us humans put on top of that reality. And those symbols, that kind of ecosystem of symbols, that is a paradigm. That's, what paradigms are composed of are symbols on reality. So now that we know what a paradigm is, it's these default assumptions. A key part in paradigms is that the shift in paradigms only occurs during a crisis. If you're just living life normally, or if the science is going normally and it's going well, you don't really need to rethink your default assumptions. But for example, right now with something like climate change, oh boy, that's forcing us to reintegrate and to recheck in with our default assumptions. So paradigm shifts happen when there's a crisis, when the old paradigm doesn't really work anymore. So the way you get to the understanding a paradigm is by getting to the root of the thing and asking 5 whys, where you just keep asking why over and over again. And so, for example, here it's like, well, why does Facebook have so many ads? Well, it's because they need to make money. Well, why do they need to make money? Well, because they're required to by their board of directors and the laws of incorporation. Well, why do those laws exist? Well, it's because we have this mindset that the company's only responsibility is profit, shareholder maximization. Well, why do we have this, profit maximization mindset? And it's partially because we have the Protestant work ethic baked into our moral set. So that's what we mean by getting to the root here, where we see some kind of overlying behavior, some symptomatic behavior, and we just keep asking why to get deeper and deeper and deeper, get to the root of the problem. And so, you can think of an iceberg. And the 5 whys get you to those paradigms. They get you deeper and deeper to these underlying set of default assumptions that we have. And as a reminder, and as a throwback to last video about systems, it's not like there's just some truth root at the bottom of everything. In fact, what you see is that everything is a system, right? Where the Protestant work ethic that we do have baked into us, at least in America, that is co-evolving with and is reinforced with profit maximizing boards. It's not like the work ethic creates everything above it. No, there's a loop between these two things. And this is kind of most shown with Marx. We're talking about Marx, people. This is a key idea from Marx called base and superstructure, where he's showing that, hey, the base is things like factories. It's the means of production. And then the superstructure are things like ideology and, art and media and stuff. And that it's not like he's saying, capitalism. And Marx says that this is how capitalism works. Capitalism is this loop. It's not just a paradigm of the factories, and the factories produce capitalism. And it's also not just a paradigm of, it's, the art and the culture and the ideology. No, it's that they shape and maintain each other. So they move in this pattern. So that's to say that whenever you're thinking in a paradigm way, you get to the root level, and there are some kind of root level paradigm things, but those also are always in a system with the rest of the system. So the way I think about this is, last time we chatted about multi-scale thinking and how you can, a key part of systems thinking is being able to think in multiple scales and see that, the ant can emerge at a higher scale into the ant colony, and that emergence is interesting and what have you. So what paradigm thinking is like is, instead of for biology, it's you doing this for ideas. So for example, on the right side here, you have, something like behavior at the very top. And then, you look at that behavior, but then you can go deeper and you can say, well, why is that behavior true? It's because of these laws. Well, why are those laws true? It's because we have this ethical mindset. Why do we have that ethical mindset? It's because we had this language that was baked in. And then why is that? Well, we had this paradigm. So this is kind of, I like to think of paradigm thinking as multi-scale thinking, but instead of for biology and kind of emergence, it's instead for ideas and concepts. So, you'll know you're working with paradigms when you get to some of this gooshier, some gooshier stuff like language and values and ethics and institutions. Once you start to think about those kind of root level primitives, that's how you know you're working with paradigms. And what it feels like to think in paradigms, I really love this piece from Donella Meadows where she says, it is to get at a gut level the paradigm that there are paradigms, and to see that itself as a paradigm, and to regard that whole realization as devastatingly funny. It is to let go into not knowing, into what the Buddhists call enlightenment. That might be a little bit extreme, but I also think it's very true, where once you think in terms of paradigms, once you think in terms of how systems or how symbols map onto reality, that you start to be aware of the paradigms around us, and that there are paradigms, and that's okay, and that's okay. So kind of you get you fall into an awareness of the underlying systems of life, and that's what it's like. So thus far, I've been talking about these paradigms as default assumptions, which is helpful in the way to get to them by asking 5 whys. But we can actually pretty clearly define what those default assumptions are composed of. And what are they composed of? Well, they are composed of 3 things: epistemology, ontology, and ethics. And epistemology is how we understand the world. It's the glasses that we wear. It's doing science and things like that. Ontology is what, instead of how, it's what. It's like, what is true? What is happening in the world? And then ethics is what is good or what is beautiful. And so when you think about paradigms, you can break all paradigms into these 3 orthogonal components, these 3 components that are orthogonal to each other. So that is what default assumptions, what paradigms are composed of, are these 3 things. And let's use those and apply them to kind of our current paradigm shift right now. And this is a key part of Roote and the Roote system, is you have this industrial age paradigm. In the industrial age paradigm, the epistemology of it was this kind of broadcast, one-dimensional nationalism thing, which means that we had mainstream media, we had newspapers, people, presidents would just talk to us from on high, and we would listen to them. And it was very clear. Things were more coherent then. So that was what how we understood the world, the epistemological frame that we had. The ontological frame is what I call factoryism, which is just this idea that we were taking the Adams frontier. We were going out west in America, or we were colonizing places. Lots of bad things were happening at this time. And we were both developing but also exploiting those frontiers, pushing them through factories, making goods, and then having that system perpetuate itself because it was making money, and then you could get more factories and more, colonization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we mean, ontologically speaking. That's what was happening. That was the self-reinforcing or self-organizing system that was being created. And then the ethical piece is liberalism. Liberalism is this idea that, hey, what's good for the collective is what's good for yourself. And so you do things that's good for yourself, and then things would bubble up and be good for everybody else. So those were kind of three crucial components. That this was the paradigm of the industrial age. And now we've shifted to the information age paradigm, and it's changed. So epistemologically speaking, we now have coherent pluralism. So instead of kind of one-dimensional, listen to the radio, here is the truth from the mainstream media, instead, anybody can post anything they want. And so we have way too much, or we have a lot of information. And so you have to be pluralistic with all of your sources that you're consuming, but you also still have to create coherence among them. So that's kind of our new epistemology. Our new ontology is networkism, which is this idea that we are exploiting and developing the bits frontier. So instead of the frontier of atoms, we're exploiting and developing the frontier of bits. We're creating Microsoft, we're creating Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. We're creating Wikipedia, and we are building these things up. And as you build these new systems, those systems can self-perpetuate because they're creating value, and then that value can be re-pushed back into the system to do more frontier exploration in terms of in the bits frontier. So that's what's happening from a ontological perspective, and then from a ethics perspective, we're experiencing bentoism. So bentoism is a nice little framework, a little 2x2, that says that instead of focus all on now me at once, you kind of zoom out from that now me focus and think about these other boxes: future me, future us, and now us. So instead of just individually focused, we're kind of collectively focused. And bentoism is just a term for this, developed by this guy Yancey Strickler. And instead of liberalism, which is always this ethic of, is it good for myself? Then it's good for everybody. Instead, with bentoism, we can start to zoom out and say, if it's good for future us, well, let's actually take that into account. So this is an example of using these three, of using epistemology, ontology, and ethics to think about our current paradigm shift. So yeah, that's what it's like. I think it's worth taking a bit of time to just feel into the Roote system here and our new paradigm. What it feels like, and I think what we all feel, is this sense of the overwhelmedness of information and this difficulty with fake news and post-truth, and how to be pluralistic and how to really try to see everybody's perspective, but also to be coherent and to not just be overwhelmed by it all. So that's what it feels like, to consume information epistemologically. And then ontologically, what is happening? Well, we start to see these massive rise of these new platforms, these new aggregators like Google, Amazon, Facebook. And that is both cool. They're very powerful and good for society in many ways, and also a little bit scary. They're, they have the power of nation states. They have the power of old companies. They have these new, they're very powerful. And we can see some weird new network-based things like hashtags, Black Lives Matter or MAGA. We can start to see things like Wikipedia and these open source projects. So there's this kind of us all watching, this bits frontier is being rearranged, and there's so much value that's being created there. And also, it's just very powerful. And so we need to be very responsible with it. And then finally, from Bentoism, it feels like, yeah, we all just need to reflect and develop an active awareness to really say, hey, we should care about future us. As Greta says, we only got one planet, people. And thinking more about our community and future generations is crucial. So, yeah, that's what it feels like to think from this root system. Okay, so if we have a paradigm, something like, this new information age paradigm, how does it get actually manifest in concrete things in reality? Well, it gets embodied in individuals and manifest in institutions. So it's kind of a multi-scale claim that I'm making there. I'm saying at the individual level, this is what it feels like. And at the institutional level, this is what it feels like. So let's talk about the individual one first. In individuals, the easiest way to see paradigms is through language, is through how we speak about things. And this is back to this nice little image of the symbolic and the real, that you have the reality underneath, and then you have the symbols of that reality that we as humans place on top in order to make meaning. And those things map pretty well onto epistemology and ontology, where ontology is what is happening, aka the real, and then epistemology is how we understand that, aka our symbols, the symbolic nature, or our symbolic, the way we do meaning making. So when you think about language, it is, when you think about our paradigms and you think about this difference between the symbolic and the real, there's this great phrase called the map is not the territory. And the idea here is that the symbolic is not the real. What we perceive as reality may not be reality. Reality is reality, And so there's this beautiful little parable that shows this, where you have a bunch of these blind folks that are looking at this elephant, and if you touch it in the front where the trunk is, you might feel like it's a snake. Or if you touch one of the tusks, you're like, oh, this is a spear. And if you touch it in the back, oh, it's a rope. So wherever you touch it, it feels different. And so these different people have different maps of reality. They have different symbolic understandings of the reality underneath. And in reality, there's this deeper territory there that is the elephant, but they cannot see it. Okay? So that's this idea of the map is not the territory. And there's some other very connected ideas here. This whole symbolic and real thing is based off this guy Lacan, who talks about the symbolic and the real all the time. And it's a crucial concept in philosophy. It's a crucial concept with this modern age Marxist philosopher Zizek. Everybody, if you can learn to think in terms of what is the real and then what are the symbols on top of that, it's a very, very, very powerful framing to constantly be running in your mind. What's the symbolic? What's the real? What's the map? What's the territory? This is also very connected to this idea of predictive processing, which the Slate Star Codex guy is really into. And predictive processing is what our brains are doing all the time, where we're seeing this real stuff that's happening, reality's coming in, and our predictive processing is trying to create mental models that actually make that reality not scary and less uncertain. And so we constantly are trying to make models of reality, symbols of reality that make reality make more sense. So you can see this happen with these cognitive biases. This is classic system 1, system 2 thinking, where our system 1 is our immediate reactions to things. It's kind of the symbols or the models that we have. And then system 2 is what is if we could actually go and we can actually go this deeper level and say, well, what are the symbolic here? What is the real here? What is the map? What is the territory? If we take more time, we can do that system 2 stuff. But really, almost all the time, we're doing this system 1 thing because it's just quicker for us. It's hard to. There's a lot of information in the world, and so this is a map of all these cognitive biases broken into categories of what should we remember? Well, probably we should remember not much stuff. Let's only remember the important things. Or, oh God, we need to act fast. Okay, ignore all that stuff. Just only think about this stuff. Or, hey, there's not enough meaning here. Let's like try to inject meaning to make this actually feel less uncertain to us. Or, oh God, there's too much information. Ignore stuff. So all of these cognitive biases are the result of our predictive processing happening and this connection between system 1 and system 2 and the map and the territory. And so the key idea with if you think about cognitive biases is this idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we're constantly trying to create maps of the territory, and that's great. And we should realize that, some of them are useful. They're all going to be wrong to some extent, but some of those maps are actually going to be pretty useful for us. So all of this, symbolic and real also connects to mindfulness and meditation. And the reason is because mindfulness is pre-symbolic. And what we mean by that is, first I'll read this from this monk, guru person, Gunaratana. And Gunaratana was asked, hey, what is mindfulness? And his response was, well, words are devised by the symbolic levels of the mind, and they describe those realities with which symbolic thinking deals. But mindfulness is pre-symbolic. It is not shackled to symbols. And what he's saying here is that there's the reality underneath, and when you're in a super mindful state, you're just seeing reality as it is, as the sensory things are coming up at every moment. And you're not, when you get really good at mindfulness and meditation, you're not putting these symbols on top of it. You're not saying, oh, that's a cup, that's a thing. Instead, stuff is just coming up and you're seeing the real as the real instead of trying to put symbols or maps on top of the real. Okay? So, as an example here, you can imagine, the pre-symbolic sensory experience on the left here of a cup, what we think of as a cup. Really, it's just a bunch of black and white lines, right? And if you're really good, you can see this as the real instead of adding the symbolic on top. But the symbolic level, what we do a lot is to add the symbolic level and say, oh, that's a cup. Okay, so it's the sensory pre-symbolic versus the symbolic, meaning level. So, one way to think about this guy, Alan Watts, says, you are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. And what that means is, we are purely just like a vessel. We're just a vessel, an aperture where, through our eyes and through our senses, we're seeing the universe do its thing. We're seeing stuff erupt into consciousness. And we are trying to put all these meaning and symbols on top of it. But in fact, the universe is just doing its thing, and we are an aperture. We are an observer of that thing. Yeah, so this is, to conclude on this, I think that this is a key part of paradigms, because when we think about those paradigms, the epistemology, the ontology, and the ethics, and when we think about how those things are actually manifest in reality, they are often manifest in ourselves in terms of language. And the best way to understand how our language is changing our reality is through this interaction of the symbolic and the real. And that by thinking in deeper and deeper paradigms, we can start to disconnect the symbolic, or we can start to reveal what symbols we're using, and we can start to get closer and closer to the real. So now let's talk about language and metaphor. That's the other crucial piece of language here as it connects to paradigms. And the idea is that, as we talked about in last episode, the field of systems thinking started when we rejected the machine metaphor and started to embrace the organism metaphor. So remember, after World War II, science had only been done in this reductionist way where we were just reducing things to parts all the time, thinking of things, how does the machine work? And once we start to do a reframe there and say, well, what if we look at how things are emerging? What if we think about these other scientific systems as organic systems, then that metaphor, that shift in metaphor, was incredibly powerful, and it led to different kinds of science being done. So metaphor is very important, and it's constantly around us. There are a couple good books on this that note, especially this one, Metaphors to Live By, that says that all abstract language is spoken in terms of physical metaphor. And what that means is, when we think about something abstract like time, well, the only way we can think about it is by turning it into a physical object and then thinking about it. So we'll say, oh, time is kind of like a moving object when we say something like, the time for building has arrived. Okay? Well, it has arrived. Oh, how did time arrive? Time is an abstract thing. How did that arrive? Well, that's how our mind works. We need to, in order to map the territory, in order to add symbols on top of the real, we need to pretend that those symbols are real. And so we give them this physical, metaphorical form, that the time is arriving. Or maybe the time's not arriving, but in fact, it's a stationary object that we come towards. So you could say, oh, as we approach 2030, well, 2030, is that really a thing that you can approach? Not really. So you can notice this time and time again with all of our speech. Anything that's not physical is abstract, but all those abstractions are represented in terms of metaphors to physical reality. So this is crucial because we all in society are thinking about, previously in our industrial age paradigm, we had thought about everything in terms of factories. There's this, the factory model of education was you get students in, you pump them full of creativity, discipline, and intelligence, and then you get these students, these graduates, these adults out the other end. And that was a fine model at the time. It was a fine metaphor for how things worked. But we are now transitioning to this metaphor of these bottom-up network-based systems. Yeah, that's the metaphor we're shifting towards. So this is another way that we can embody paradigms as individuals. Our language is always doing this metaphorical thing, and those metaphors are very, very important. And a shift that's happening now is the metaphor of the factory to the metaphor of the network or the system or the organism. Okay, so now let's chat about the second piece here, which is how paradigms are manifest in institutions. So, so you can imagine a paradigm with the epistemology, ontology, and ethics, and some of it gets manifest in this individual language, the symbolic onto the real. But some of it gets manifest in institutions and as incentives. And what I mean by this is, or the best way to understand this, in my opinion, is with this Lessig's pathetic dot. So this is Lawrence Lessig, a Creative Commons guy, and he talks about how essentially the forces that are shaping all of us, and those forces are markets, laws, norms, and code. And as an example of these, we can see, so this is, something like markets are financial incentives. If you want to affect me, you can say, hey, Reese, here's some money. Or, oh, if you do this bad thing, I will fine you money. Something like a law is an incentive because you say, hey, Reese, if you do a bad thing here, you're going to go to jail for 5 years. Something like a norm is an incentive because it's a social incentive. It's praise or shame, shaming someone. And so it's like, oh, I want to get praise, and I don't want shame. So, okay, do the good thing, and then everybody will like you. And then code also creates incentives, kind of from a user experience perspective and friction, where you say, oh, if Facebook wants you to click on the button, or if Google wants you to click on the ad, they'll put it at the very top of their page. So that's what we mean by Lessig's dot. You can see how it manifests our now me ethical paradigm, our the one we're currently in, kind of, with something like markets. Markets, incentivize this now me thinking because the stock price increases if quarterly profit increases. So it's like, okay, this is why you get these quarterly profit maximizers, is because that's what the stock market's optimized for. On the law side, well, we also have incentives for that because the CEO, is required to run the company in the shareholders' best interest. And so, yeah, of course they're going to be kind of, shareholder focused and now me focused, because they're required to. There's also these norms where you get praised for being wealthy, and more wealth. And so there's a norm around, of course it's okay to be, a profit maximizing company. And then through something like code, you can see this when you go on the websites these days, and there's just ads everywhere. And well, why is that true? Well, it's because they're trying to make money, And so these are all manifestations of a paradigm, the ethical paradigm, how they get manifest in Lessig's dot. So you can also see this with one other example here, something like systemic racism, which is part of society and will continue to be part of society, and hopefully will not continue in the future though. And it's manifest in markets as stuff like, white income being 1.5 times black income. It's manifest in laws. It was as like something like redlining, where we had, these racist undertones, post Jim Crow era. And it was like, okay, now we're going to make it the case that white people can live over here and black people can only live in these areas. They have to be within the red lines. Those were laws. So it was a mindset that was then embedded in a law. In norms, there's getting praise for racist jokes. I know even for me within my high school and middle school days, when I was less woke and or aware of myself and society, I would do racist jokes and sexist jokes, and I would get praised for them. And so that was part of this. And then also with something like code, there are these AI risk scores where you look at someone and you say, how risky is this person? Should we let them go on bail or not? And you say, okay, if they're poor and have poverty or whatever and are black or something, well then those people are at higher risk, therefore we should keep them behind bars. And that's bad because it is using the AI as a crystal ball instead of a mirror, instead of using it to reflect back on ourselves and go, well, why is it the case that, poor folks, commit crimes more? Instead, we use it as a crystal ball to say, this poor folk is going to, commit more crimes. So again, these are examples of systemic racism, kind of this mindset or this paradigm being embedded and manifest in institutions and in these incentives. And I just want to put a quick note on that final one, which is this: if we want to think of feedback loops too, you can think of a feedback loop between, hey, if you have, poverty and over-policing, well, then you're going to get higher crime rates. Then you're going to get the AI giving a high risk score, which creates more jail time, which creates more poverty for those families and those communities. And now we're back at the first one, which is poverty and over-policing, more crime rates. So this is just a classic feedback loop between poverty and crime, where if you have more poverty, you'll get more crime, and then that crime then creates more poverty. So yeah, to conclude about that one, the paradigms get manifest in institutions as well, mostly through that Lessig's dot. So these are the things we chatted about today. And, we talked about paradigms, we defined them, how they show up during these crises, getting to understand paradigms by really diving into the 5 whys, really understanding those 3 pillars of paradigms, the epistemology, ontology, and ethics, and then looking at how those paradigms are actually manifest in reality, how they're embodied in individuals as language and metaphor, and then how they're manifest in institutions as well. And so before concluding here, I want to give a little bit of a vibe for what it feels like to think in paradigms. So I'm just going to feel my body for a second. Yeah, so paradigms, thinking in them is difficult because it's very abstract. And you're trying to break down your symbolic understanding of reality. And so it requires introspection and focus, or it requires a crisis. to really understand the model that your mind had of reality, or the map that you had of the territory. And that's both personally, but also societally, where you're like, wow, society thinks in this way. Huh, that's crazy. So that's what it feels like. And it also feels like, the key 3-pillar distinction of, okay, understanding how we all do our sense making, the epistemology, understanding what's actually happening, the real, these kind of reinforcing feedback loops, and the frontiers of society, and finally the ethics, where we're going, where we're trying to go. So it feels like this zooming out process to understand paradigms, and then also this zooming in process to think about how these paradigms are manifest in ourselves and also manifest in institutions and incentives that we have. Yeah. So what it will feel like to integrate your learning, and also things to watch out for, as you start to think in paradigms, one thing you'll start to do is you'll start to say everything is a paradigm. You'll say, well, my cat likes to eat wet food. That's his paradigm. And it's good to start to try to use paradigms, but it's so I would start by overusing it, but then you can start to really differentiate the concept, and you can get to mastery by really trying to only use paradigms for these deep assumptions, these, and especially, the set of assumptions and unconscious assumptions. And so you'll start to use the word paradigm a lot, but then you'll get better at really only using it for kind of deep unconscious assumptions and beliefs that we have. The other thing that it feels like is this active awareness of language and metaphor in life. So, for example, my friend and I were chatting about the other day how we think of humanity as a virus. And it's like, oh, humanity's a virus. Well, we're just going to consume the earth and then we'll die, and maybe the earth will be rebirthed after that. And that's okay, but that's like not a great metaphor for us. Can we think of ourselves as stewards or gardeners instead? Like, that's what we used to be a long time ago, and that's what we can become again. And so thinking about these metaphors that we can self-fulfilling prophecy ourselves into is a very, very powerful framing. So you'll start to become aware of the metaphors in life. And you'll also become aware of, and if you're not already, I highly recommend meditation and being able to be present with things. And once you start to be present and listen to your breath and just, be in nature, you can really be present to this pre-symbolic sensory experience of just the warmth on your skin or the feeling of your breath, instead of adding all those symbols on top. And once you start to do that, then you'll start to be better and better at differentiating the symbols from reality, perception of reality, and you'll start to perceive perception itself. And you'll also be very attuned to signaling, all these symbols that everybody's putting all around all the time, and people signaling, oh, I'm this company is a woke company, they believe XYZ. Well, is that just a signal, or are they connecting that to the underlying reality of their goals? So that's what that feels like, is this active awareness of language in your life. And then finally, you'll start to kind of connect these paradigms or these other deep assumptions like ethics and morals. You'll start to connect them to Lessig's dot. And you'll start to say things like, let's say that I believe, cats are bad. Then you'll start to say, well, how is that manifest in code? Oh, maybe, he deprioritizes the cats on his website. Or how is that, manifest in norms? Does he, shame people for being cat lovers or not cat lovers or whatever? So you'll start to always think, codes, norms, law, and markets as a way to see how these things are actually manifest. Okay. So thank you for listening today. I hope it was a helpful way to understand paradigms and get you closer to a deeper understanding of reality. Again, if you're not, please join this fellowship or check out this beautiful community of world-class systems thinkers that are into these kind of things. We're at Roote.co. Okay, thank you and goodbye.